The night was colder than usual, the wind whistling through the cracks of the old grocery store's sliding doors. Inside, under the dim glow of fluorescent lights, Jake sighed as he scanned the last few items on the counter. It had been a long shift, and his feet ached from standing all day. He was just about to call for the next customer when he noticed a woman in the line ahead of him, frantically rummaging through her purse. Her hands trembled slightly, her lips pressed together in a tight, worried line. She wasn't just another customer to him. He recognized her, Sarah. She had come into the store a few times before, usually with her newborn tucked in a carrier against her chest. A single mother, from what he had gathered, always looking tired, always careful with what she spent. Tonight, her distress was impossible to ignore. "I'm so sorry," she muttered, her voice barely above a whisper, as she looked at the cashier ahead of Jake's line. "I thought I had enough." Jake's eyes fell on the item in her hands, a single can of baby formula. His heart clenched. He had seen this before. People struggling to pay for necessities, making impossible choices at the checkout. He hated it. The idea of a mother going home empty-handed, with a hungry baby waiting, made his stomach turn. Without a second thought, Jake stepped forward. "I got it," he said, pulling out his wallet. Sarah's eyes widened. No, I can't. "It's fine," he insisted with a small smile, already swiping his card before she could protest. "Consider it a small act of kindness." Her eyes shimmered with unshed tears. She opened her mouth, but no words came out at first. Then, in a shaky voice, she said, "Thank you. Really, thank you so much." Jake just shrugged, feeling a little awkward. "Just take care of your little one." Sarah held the canister close, nodding quickly before glancing down at her baby, who was fast asleep in the carrier. "You don't know what this means to me," she said softly, as if she were afraid the words wouldn't be enough. Jake watched her leave, a warmth spreading through his chest. He had no idea what her story was, what struggles she faced every day. But in that moment, he didn't need to. He just hoped that one small gesture had made a difference. The next day, Jake returned to work as usual, expecting nothing to come of it. He hadn't done it for praise or recognition. It was just the right thing to do. But as he walked into the store, something felt different. His manager, Mr. Thompson, was standing near the entrance, waiting for him. "There's someone here to see you," Mr. Thompson said, a knowing smile playing on his lips. Confused, Jake followed his gaze, and then froze. Sarah stood near the counter, but she wasn't alone. Beside her was an older man in a sharp suit. His posture, straight and commanding. There was something about him. His presence filled the room, demanding attention without saying a word. Jake's stomach flipped. Who was this man? And why was he here with Sarah? As he hesitantly approached, Sarah met his eyes with a soft, almost nervous smile. "Jake," she said, her voice filled with something that sounded like disbelief. "I wanted you to meet my father." The older man stepped forward, extending a hand. "I'm Richard Caldwell," he said, his voice steady, unreadable. "Sarah told me what you did for her last night." Jake hesitated before shaking his hand. Richard's grip was firm, strong. He could tell this was a man who was used to being in control. "I just bought some formula," Jake said, rubbing the back of his neck. "It wasn't a big deal." Richard let out a small, knowing chuckle. "Perhaps not to you, but to my daughter it meant the world." Jake glanced at Sarah, who nodded. There was an emotion in her eyes that made him shift uncomfortably. Gratitude mixed with something deeper, something he didn't quite understand yet. And then Richard reached into his pocket and pulled out a small envelope. "This is for you," he said, holding it out. Jake frowned. "Sir, I really don't need—" "Please," Richard interrupted, his expression unreadable. "Just open it." Jake hesitated before taking the envelope. He flipped it open, and his breath caught in his throat. Inside was a check with an amount that made his mind go blank. His heart pounded. His fingers shook slightly as he looked back up at Richard, then at Sarah. "What is this?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Richard smiled, but there was something unreadable in his expression. "A token of appreciation," he said simply. Jake swallowed hard. This wasn't just a small thank you. This was something else, something bigger, and in that moment he realized his simple act of kindness had set something in motion, something he wasn't sure he was ready for. Jake stared at the check in his hands, his mind racing. The amount written on it wasn't just generous. It was life-changing, more money than he had ever seen in his life. His first instinct was to refuse. He had only paid for a can of baby formula, something that had cost him no more than a couple of bills from his pocket. But this felt too much, too sudden, and he wasn't sure what to do with it. His throat felt dry as he finally found his voice. "Mr. Caldwell, I can't accept this." Richard Caldwell studied him for a long moment, his sharp eyes unreadable. "Why not?" Jake hesitated, glancing at Sarah, who looked just as expectant. "Because I didn't do it for a reward," he admitted. "I just wanted to help." Richard's lips twitched, as if he had expected that answer. "That's exactly why you should take it," he said. "People like you, people who do the right thing when no one's watching. You don't come around often." Jake still felt uneasy. This wasn't how things worked. People didn't just hand out checks to grocery store clerks for doing something decent. He had been scraping by, living paycheck to paycheck, barely keeping up with his rent. And yet, taking this money felt strange. Sarah, sensing his hesitation, stepped forward. "Jake, my father isn't just giving this to you as some random gesture," she explained. "He wants to offer you something more." Jake looked up, confused. "More?" Richard nodded. "I own several businesses, including a chain of high-end grocery stores," he said. "I've been looking for someone with the right kind of character to join my team. Someone I can trust. If you're willing, I'd like to offer you a better job. Something beyond standing behind a register all day." Jake's heart pounded. This wasn't just a check. This was an opportunity. A way out of the life he had been stuck in. But why him? "I don't get it," Jake admitted, shaking his head. "You don't even know me." Richard's expression softened slightly. "I know enough," he said. "I know that in a world where too many people turn a blind eye, you stepped forward. You didn't do it for attention. You didn't hesitate. That says more about you than a resume ever could." Jake felt the weight of their words pressing down on him. His entire life, he had struggled to get by, working small jobs that barely covered the bills. He had learned to expect little, to never hope for too much, and now, out of nowhere, he was being handed a chance to change his future. But something about it made him uneasy. It felt too good to be true. And in his experience, things that seemed too good usually were. "I appreciate this," he said slowly, carefully. "But I need to think about it." Richard nodded, as if he had expected that answer. "Take your time," he said. "But don't let doubt stop you from stepping into something better." With that, he handed Jake a business card and walked out, Sarah following close behind. Jake stood there, the check still in his hands, his mind a mess of thoughts. That night, he lay awake in his small one-bedroom apartment, staring at the ceiling. His place was nothing special, just a worn-out couch, a mattress on the floor, and a kitchen barely big enough for one person. He had spent years working jobs that went nowhere, saving what little he could, never able to get ahead. And now, in one moment, that could all change. But something about it made him hesitate. He wasn't the kind of guy people handed opportunities to. Was this really about kindness? Or was there something else behind it? The next day, he went to work like usual, pretending nothing had changed. But he couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming. Something big. And he was right. That evening, as he stepped out of the store after his shift, he noticed a sleek black car parked by the curb. The back window rolled down, and to his surprise, Sarah was sitting inside. "Get in," she said, her expression serious. Jake hesitated before climbing in, the door clicking shut behind him. "I know you're having doubts," she said before he could speak. "And I get it. My father isn't an easy man to figure out. But there's something I need to tell you before you make your decision." Jake turned to her, confused. "What do you mean?" She took a deep breath. "There's more to this than just a job offer," she admitted. "My father, he doesn't usually do things like this. But when I told him about what you did, it wasn't just about kindness to him. It was personal." Jake frowned. "Personal?" Sarah hesitated, then nodded. "Years ago, before he was successful, my dad was in a tough place. He was broke, struggling, and no one would help him. But one man did. A grocery store clerk, just like you. He loaned my father a few dollars to buy food when he had nothing. My dad never forgot it." Jake's chest tightened. "So this is about paying it forward?" Sarah nodded. "In a way, yes. But also, I think he sees something in you. Something that reminds him of himself." Jake exhaled, running a hand through his hair. The weight of it all suddenly felt even heavier. "I don't know what to do," he admitted. Sarah looked at him carefully. "Then let me help you decide," she said. "Come with me, just for one day. See the life my father is offering you. And if you still don't want it, you can walk away." Jake hesitated. Then before he could second-guess himself, he nodded. "All right," he said. "Show me." Sarah smiled, but there was something in her eyes. Something that told Jake this was only the beginning. And as the car pulled away from the store, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was stepping into something far bigger than he ever imagined. The car moved smoothly through the city, taking Jake far from the grocery store and the life he had always known. He sat in silence, watching the streets blur past, feeling like he was caught in something much bigger than himself. Sarah sat beside him, her expression unreadable, as if she knew what he was feeling, but didn't want to push him to talk. After a while, they pulled into a long driveway leading up to a massive estate. Jake had seen houses like this in movies. Tall iron gates, manicured lawns, a driveway so wide it could fit 5 of his tiny apartments inside it. He swallowed hard as the car rolled to a stop in front of the house. "This is your father's place?" he asked, still trying to wrap his head around it. Sarah nodded. "It's where I grew up." Jake stepped out of the car, his shoes pressing against the smooth stone of the driveway. Everything about this place screamed wealth, power, and a world he had never been a part of. And yet, he had somehow been invited into it. As they walked inside, the air smelled of fresh flowers and expensive wood polish. The ceilings were impossibly high, the chandeliers glowing softly in the evening light. Jake felt out of place, like he didn't belong, but Sarah walked ahead like it was nothing. "My dad's in his study," she said, leading him down a long hallway. When they entered, Richard Caldwell was sitting behind a large wooden desk, going through some papers. He looked up as they walked in. setting his pen down with a small smile. "Glad you came," Richard said. Jake nodded, shifting his weight. "I figured I should at least hear you out." Richard motioned for him to sit, then leaned back in his chair. "I know this is a lot to take in," he admitted, "and I don't expect you to trust me right away. But I meant what I said. This is an opportunity. A real one." Jake hesitated before speaking. "What exactly do you want me to do?" Richard smiled slightly. "I want you to work with me," he said. "Not just as an employee, but as someone I can mentor. You have the kind of integrity that money can't buy. I could use someone like you on my team." Jake's mind spun. The idea of working for a man like Richard, of stepping into a life so different from his own, felt impossible. But at the same time, a small part of him wondered, what if this was the break he had been waiting for? Still, something didn't sit right. "Why me?" he asked again. "There are 100 people who would take this offer without question. Why are you giving it to me?" Richard sighed, his gaze steady. "Because once I was in your shoes," he admitted, "and someone saw something in me that I didn't see in myself. If that man hadn't helped me, I wouldn't be here today. I want to do the same for you." Jake let out a breath. The way Richard spoke, the way he looked at him, it was different from any boss he had ever met. There was no arrogance, no empty promises, just an offer, one that could change everything. But before he could answer, Sarah's phone buzzed. She glanced at it, and her face suddenly went pale. "What is it?" Richard asked, noticing her reaction. Sarah swallowed hard. "It's from the store," she said, her voice tight. "Someone tried to rob it." Jake's stomach dropped. "What? When?" "Just now," she said. "They're saying a guy with a mask came in with a knife. One of the cashiers got hurt." Jake shot to his feet. "I have to go." Richard looked at him surprised. "Jake, the police are already handling it." "I don't care," Jake cut in. "That's my store. Those are my co-workers. I need to make sure they're okay." Richard watched him for a moment, then nodded. "I'll have my driver take you." Minutes later, they were speeding back through the city. Jake's heart pounded as they neared the store, flashing red and blue lights illuminating the parking lot. He jumped out of the car before it had fully stopped, running toward the entrance. Inside, chaos had settled into an eerie quiet. A few of his co-workers sat on the floor, shaken but unharmed. Then he saw Lisa, the cashier who had been covering his shift. She was sitting on a chair, holding her arm, a bandage wrapped around her wrist where the knife had cut her. Jake rushed over. "Lisa, are you okay?" She gave him a shaky smile. "I will be. Just a scratch." Jake exhaled, his hands gripping the back of the chair. He had worked here for years. This store wasn't just a job. It was a part of his life. And seeing it like this, seeing the people he cared about hurt, made something inside him shift. Richard and Sarah entered behind him, surveying the damage. "This happens more than you think," Lisa muttered. "People get desperate, and when you're desperate, you do crazy things." Jake looked at her, then at the store, the shelves he had stocked, the register he had stood behind, the people he had worked with. He turned to Richard. "I'll take your offer," he said, his voice firm. "But not just for me. If you want to help, let's start here. Let's fix places like this. Make them safer. Give people a way out before they get desperate." Richard's expression shifted. Surprise? Then something close to pride. He extended his hand. "Then let's get to work." Jake shook it, knowing that from this moment on, everything was about to change. Days later, Jake stood outside the store, watching as new security cameras were installed. As safety measures were put in place, Richard had kept his word. But more than that, Jake had found something bigger than just a job. He had found a purpose. As he walked back toward the store, Sarah fell into step beside him. "So," she said, grinning, "not bad for a guy who was just trying to buy some baby formula, huh?" Jake chuckled. "Yeah, guess life has a funny way of surprising you." And as he stepped back into the place where everything had started, he knew this was only the beginning.